Okay, so well, shall we wait one more minute? Maybe one more minute, and then it's time for us to get going. So we're very happy to. Oh, there's someone else coming. Sorry. Um, very happy to have Norman Sandridge, UNC PhD. Though of course that's not why he was invited. um, to um, to share with us thoughts on his book, Rise of the Benevolent Octopus. Um, Norman is now an associate professor of classics in the political science department at Howard University. So he'll talk for a few minutes about his book, and then we'll hand over to our two respondents, and we'll have some general discussion after that. So, Norman, let me hand over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily, for convening all of us. Thanks to the International Xenophon Society, my favorite international society in the whole world. I love that we're an international group, and it is such an honor and a pleasure anytime we can get together. And I want to thank, I don't know if Gabriel's going to be on this, but if he later sees the recording, I want to thank him again so much for convening us all in Israel now, like 6 years ago. Brought me in contact with many, many wonderful Xenophonic scholars that I would otherwise never have been able to connect with. And, you know, let's just keep on going. I love this group so much. So I shared, there's a link there to a PDF of just some references that I'm going to make in my brief remarks. I wrote them down because I tend to be a little bit long-winded. So I'm going to get right to it. And then I'm so grateful to Ellen and Greg for their responses. Okay, so for my brief remarks today, I want to give you an overview of what I was trying to do when I wrote Rise of the Benevolent Octopus, and also give you some sense of why I was doing it. Specifically, I want to talk about the genre I was writing in, which I called a meditation. Readers of ancient literature may immediately think of the meditation of Marcus Aurelius, and I was too. Aurelius even appears in the work. But I could probably do no better to describe this book than to share the assessment of one of its readers, a NASA meteorologist and true lover of ancient literature named Oreste Real, who began as a stranger and since has become a friend. He says of the work, "It has something that reminds me of Macrobius, particularly the Commentarii in Somnium Scipionis and the Saturnalia, which are a blend of philosophical dialogue, an introspective analysis, a menagerie of illusions, and much more, but all within a context that has the scent of epics." What I find fascinating and funny about Oreste's assessment is that it's pretty much spot on, even though I have never read the Somnium Scipionis, much less Macrobius's commentaries on it, and I didn't even know what Macrobius's Saturnalia was until I looked it up on Wikipedia. Indeed, I am not that sophisticated. My idea of a meditation as a genre of literature is itself generic. I was mainly just working with the Oxford English Dictionary's second definition of a meditation, which is, quote, "the action or act of meditating, continuous thought or musing upon one subject or series of subjects, a period of serious or sustained reflection or mental contemplation," end quote. Rise of the Benevolent Octopus is, in this sense, a meditation on the conditions and practices of leadership development through the study of the humanities. For me, this meditation consisted of 5 interrelated questions. This is on your handout if you're following along. 1, how do metaphors influence how we think about and embody leadership? 2, what is leadership? And related, what is counterfeit leadership? And what are the requisites of leadership? 3, how do we cultivate leadership through the study of the humanities? 4, how do we find the benevolence to lead? And 5, how conducive is our contemporary age or ecosystem for cultivating benevolent octopuses? The form of the book then follows its function. That is, I included whatever I thought would help me engage with these questions and whatever I thought it would be engaging for readers, whatever I thought would be engaging for readers who were interested in these questions. Now I want to take you briefly through the 5 episodes of the book and explain how the work took shape according to these different questions I was meditating on. First of all, the entire book is framed as an anxiety dream. The dream gave me complete flexibility to include all the different settings and characters I needed, and it allowed me to use all sorts of special effects that contradicted the rules of time, space, and even natural law. In the first episode, called The Phantom Metaphor, the narrator, that is me, is unexpectedly in a bookstore set to give a talk on a book called Rise of the Benevolent Octopus, which I have no recollection of having written or even thought of. Here, rather than trying to convince the reader that the benevolent octopus is the best metaphor for leadership, I let the reader discover it along with the narrator. I spend the episode trying to guess what's in the book, while members of the bookstore audience take turns helping me figure out how an octopus could be a good metaphor for leadership, and then criticizing what I come up with. The scene concludes with the embarrassing recognition that I have never defined leadership to begin with. I take up the question of how to define leadership in the second episode, called The Most Wondrous Thing. The scene is set at a Great Ideas conference, where our beloved Xenophon gives a lecture on leadership, which he defines using Cyropaedia 1.67 as addressing the needs and activating the potential of others. He calls this the most wondrous thing you can do. Not to be upstaged, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg are impressed with Xenophon's definition and turn to Socrates to judge which of them is the best example of it. And you have to read the book to find out who wins. Episode 3 is called Arms and the Man, a nod to Virgil's Aeneid and many other things besides. Here I am in an elite social club, and the members of the table, unaware of me, are going on about how Rise of the Benevolent Octopus has gotten terrible reviews because the author did not really include much of himself and did not really explain what the conditions and practices of leadership development through the humanities were. I then suddenly appear at the table and again try to answer their objections as well as I can. This leads me to reflect on my own intellectual memoir and how I got into the study of ancient leadership in the first place, including my relationship with my father and later my Latin professor who became my mentor. In episode 4, called The Arts of Benevolence, I am riding precariously in the back seat of a car that appears to be driving itself. On the radio, I am listening to an interview on NPR featuring the tragic playwright Sophocles, who has just published a book called, you guessed it, Rise of the Benevolent Octopus. The interviewer asks him to explain what he means by benevolence and how he thinks we may cultivate it. His reflections include discussion of his play Philoctetes, as well as his friendship with Herodotus. In all, he identifies 5 kinds of benevolence that we could cultivate to fuel our leadership. The final episode of the book is called The Octopus's Garden. And here I am in an enchanted forest with 8 of my treasured Howard students. They are preparing for a final exam for a course I am teaching on necromancy and immortality. But we quickly become distracted by the question of whether or not our current age is best suited for nurturing benevolent octopuses. All 8 students weigh in on the question, and their final exam turns out to be a group essay on what we may do to nurture future octopuses. The work concludes with an anagnorisis, or recognition scene, and an awakening that I won't spoil for you here if you haven't read it. Throughout this framework of an anxiety dream, I employ a number of genres, the most prevalent of which is the Socratic dialogue. You will also detect a catabasis, or journey to the underworld, a lot of personal confession and memoir, as well as satire. One reader even found the work to be a response or counterpoint to J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, given the fact that he and I took very different paths from our white working class upbringing. I also employ every literary device I can think of to try to make the themes of the work as vivid and memorable as possible. I use prosopopoeia, praeteritio, ring composition, preamels, allegory, figura etymologica, and of course, metaphor. There's probably an average of 1 carefully selected hapax legomenon on every page. And the entire work is bound together with eight deep allusions to works of music, literature, and film, namely the Trojan epic cycle, Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, Plato's Republic, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and the movie that it's based on, Blade Runner, Paul Simon's The Obvious Child from his album Rhythm of the Saints, John Lennon's In My Life off Rubber Soul, and finally the movie Field of Dreams. This is all to say that for me, a meditation is, by the Oxford definition, a continuous musing on a series of important questions. And the muses were with me throughout, as I employed every other genre and literary device I could think of to complete the journey and to make it a story worth telling. Finally, you may be wondering, why did I write a meditation of all things, rather than a scholarly work on leadership development, or at least some handy manual on the topic? My first reason was personal. I wrote this meditation to get clarity in my own head about topics so fascinating, they keep me up at night all the time. And I wanted to write something that would link my own lived experience, both in thought and in action, with these great questions. I also found this vehicle to be a great way to pay tribute to all the wonderful minds that keep me company inside my own head. My second reason for writing this was professional. I'm fortunate to teach leadership development to amazing students at Howard University, and I'm also the co-founder of a nonprofit called Callion Leadership that works with educators as well as people in businesses and nonprofits on leadership development. One example of our work in Callion is a program I'm working on with a highly enlightened construction company in San Antonio, Texas, featuring the education of Cyrus. Thus, from within these two roles, I wanted to create something that would hopefully resonate with lots of different people, including my students, my colleagues in ancient leadership, CEOs, politicians, artists, and pretty much anyone who wanted to see themselves as authentic agents of leadership. And I would point you, if you're looking in the handout, I would point you to the comments from advanced readers if you want to see how different people have been reacting to it. I'll end here and just say that I would encourage all of you, everyone on this Zoom, to consider writing your own meditation on leadership or whatever is lighting up your mind. I can say I, for one, would be eager to read it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norman. That was a wonderful sort of overview you've given us there. Let's hand over now to Ellen for our first response.
So good morning, everybody. For me, it's morning, excuse me, here in Portland, Oregon. And it's lovely to see many familiar faces. So first, I'm going to say that I found it at the beginning very challenging figuring out how I was going to respond to this book. Precisely, Norman, because it's so complex. It has so many genres. It speaks to so many audiences. And I have to say, everything that I've just said about it, I think would have probably made it very appealing to Xenophon. One would hope if Xenophon could read this. Okay, so first, I would like to begin by congratulating Norman for this compelling book that at times really made me laugh. I have to say, especially the dialogues involving Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos, especially given Elon Musk's huge payout, which I'm sure you all heard about this week. At other times, Norman, it touched me, especially in your accounts of your relationship with your father and that very influential teacher. And it had me also thinking deeply about my own experiences as a student, a scholar, and a professor. I was really heartened by Norman's description of the humanities as a natural foundation for the development of leadership by providing essential tools for critical thinking, for opening students' horizons to different ways of being and thinking, and thereby helping them to empathize and communicate with others, and to motivate people to lead by addressing the needs and potential of others. At a time when the academy is under increasing scrutiny and assault, Norma's book reminded me of the fundamental importance of what we do and how we can both be better leaders and promote leadership among our students. I've been asked today to respond to Norman's work from the vantage point of Xenophonic scholarship. As soon as I started really getting into Norman's arguments, I thought that Xenophon is a polymath with a wide variety of intellectual interests and an unusually broad view of the world at his time, could meet some of the main criteria for an effective octopus. And this is the view that Norman has Socrates echo, and I'm going to quote Norman on page 88. Quote, if anyone deserves to be in the league of octopuses, it is Xenophon, both a noophile, and again, Norman would define this term as someone who's driven to understand the thoughts, feelings, and motivations of others on their own terms, and as a Xenophont, someone who is aware of their own thoughts, feelings, and motivations, and knows how to communicate them to others, and is driven to do so in order to activate their potential. Xenophon came to know the minds of the masters of the universe of his day, people like the Persian Prince Cyrus the Younger, the Spartan General Clearchus, someone who's obsessed me in my own career, the Spartan King Agesilaus, whom Xenophon idolized. He even studied and captured the mind of Cyrus II, the first king of the Persian Empire, as well as numerous poets, artists, statesmen, and more than a few knaves. Love that word, Norman. And again, as Norman also goes to point out, or his Socrates points out, we should remember that Xenophon was a knight in the Athenian cavalry. We learn about his important leadership in the Anabasis. And as Socrates concludes, I cannot think of anyone more worthy of helping us find a definition of leadership. Xenophon, I would argue, though, also supports Socrates' description in his study of leadership from a number of different perspectives across his corpus. Scholars continue to examine his interest in the issue of leadership from a number of angles, as, for example, the Histos volume on the aspects of leadership in Xenophon, edited, and I know, Richard, you're here, by Richard Fernando Buxton, 2016, as this work clearly demonstrates. Throughout his corpus, we can see Xenophon's interest in the traits and experiences that make commanders effective, many of which dovetail with Norman's ideas about the groundwork to create effective leadership. For example, Xenophon identifies as intelligent generals who foster willing and productive men. This is in the Economicus 21.5. In several works, including the Cyropaedia and the Hipparchicus, Xenophon also claims that the effective commander must be both considered and demonstrate that he is wiser than his men concerning the conduct of operations against the enemy. Xenophon likewise makes it clear that the effective leader communicates clearly to the men under his command, as when he claims that the commander must help those under his authority understand why obedience is both necessary and beneficial. And this is, again, in the Hipparchicus at several points. At other points in his corpus, Xenophon emphasizes the importance of reciprocal emotional bonds between a leader and the men under his command. As Norman has demonstrated in his 2012 publication on the Cyropaedia, philanthropia is a key for effective leadership, according to Xenophon. Consider, for example, Cambyses' advice to Cyrus at Cyropaedia 1:624-25, where he claims that the leader must always be in a position to do good to those under one's command and to sympathize with them. Xenophon, finally, also clearly recognized the importance of good role models. In his Cyropaedia, once again, he suggests that the modeling of virtues, and this is at 128, the modeling of virtues is important not just for military training, but also, more importantly, the general education of young men. Xenophon's works thus collectively depict him as a firm contender for the title of Octopus, for it is through these works that he helps his readers gain the knowledge that is the key to successful leadership. The knowledge that Socrates emphasizes in the Memorabilia, and this is at 3, 9, 10, quote, kings and rulers are not those who hold the scepter, nor those who are elected by sundry people, nor those on whom the lot falls, nor those who use force or deception, but those who understand epistamenous, how to rule, end quote. When we meet Xenophon in the Anabasis, moreover, we see a leader who seems to meet the requisites of leadership that Socrates spells out, according to Xenophon's own definition. This is pages 137 to 139 of Norman's book. So I'll list them. One, knowledge of human needs. An agent of leadership must know what human beings need in general terms, but an agent of leadership must also know human needs in specific cases. Two, knowledge of human potential, not only in general terms, but for each individual. Three, knowledge of how to address human needs. Wanting to lead doesn't equal being able to lead. Four, knowing knowledge of how to activate human potential. Again, wanting to activate it is not being able to actually activating. And finally, an all-encompassing imperial vision. And according to Norman, this is a vision that harmonizes leadership, the leader's leadership activity across their multiple provinces and most aligns with their resources, opportunities, talents, and especially their passions. And then, as Norman says, leadership should neither be selfless nor selfish, but we might say self-full. And here, Norman, I have to say that I'm not completely sure about what self-full means, but I'd love to hear you explain that today. And moreover, one might have noticed that at this point, like in my talk, in my presentation, that Socrates and I, at least Norman Socrates and I, agree that Xenophon deserves to be in the League of Octopuses. But neither of us have described Xenophon as a benevolent octopus. And here I'm going to hazard a reading of Xenophon with which Norman and some of you might take issue. As a leader who was in fact very concerned with his reputation and for being remembered as one who was truly concerned with the well-being of the men under his command in the Anabasis. And we see this at several points, for example, in speeches at like in book 7, like 7, 6, 4, 11, and 35. Now, if he's demonstrating benevolence in this work, and I'd like to hear what Norman will say, it is not to my mind what Norman terms the benevolence of anonymous immortality in page 258. I will, however, argue that Xenophon, through his corpus, did become the kind of benevolent octopus that Norman has in mind. His comparatively broad range of experience and interest in learning about and truly understanding, and to use Norman's term, digesting others, is clear in his works that address a variety of people's topics and questions. It is this aspect of Xenophon that makes him at once so challenging and so rewarding for the scholar who's willing to engage with his large and surprisingly multifaceted corpus. Xenophon, from what I have seen, encouraged both students and scholars to become more empathetic by considering a variety of viewpoints and seeing the world not only from the angle of an Athenian, a Persian, or a Spartan, but also from the perspective of a philosopher, a historian, a eulogist, a practitioner of war, and a human who lived during a particularly tumultuous period in Greek history. More importantly, as I've now seen at several Xenophonic conferences, and I've been so lucky to have been invited to these, Xenophon's corpus simultaneously forces people to communicate with others who work on totally different texts and issues, and to learn from those who approach the text in very different ways. Whether it is the historian engaging with a philosopher or the philologist engaging with scholars who are more focused on the ancient economy. Particularly octopusian, if I can use that adjective, perhaps is the discourse that such discussions generate and through which the community of scholars try to meet one another's intellectual needs and to help them actualize their potential, both as teachers and scholars. I'm going to end on what I will say, hope is a hopeful note, that we can only hope that we have learned from Xenophon, probably unconsciously, to bring these practices into our own approach to teaching and mentoring, and to realize the promise that the humanities possesses as a cultivator of leadership. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Ellen. We're going to save questions and comments to the very end, including the question you've invited Norman to address. So I'll hand over right now to Greg. Greg McBrayer, Interim Provost at Ashland University. We thought it might be nice to have someone who's exercising leadership right now in the context of higher education. So let me hand over to you, Greg.
Thank you. You forgot to add, with an iron fist, I'm governing here at the institution. I'd like to thank Norm Sandridge for suggesting my name to the International Xenophon Society as someone who might intelligently comment on his fantastic book. I'd like to thank the president of the International Xenophon Society, Dr. Emily Baragwanath, for extending to me a warm invitation to join you all. And finally, thanks to all present. I'll begin with a rhetorical question. How many members, in other words, don't answer. How many members of the International Xenophon Society are there? I mean, really, how many Xenophon scholars are there in the entire world? We're not like Plato scholars, where you can shake any old oak tree or peel back some ivy, or knock down every third floor in Oxford or Cambridge and find one. You have to look hard to find someone who's even heard of Xenophon. Among classicists, not being one myself, but since Norm is now infiltrating the political science world, I can maybe infiltrate his classics world. I understand that the Greek folks see themselves as the Navy SEALs and the Latinists as the everyday foot soldiers. We Xenophon scholars similarly see ourselves relative to Plato scholars. There aren't many of us, which makes it all the more strange, a more curious coincidence that two Xenophon scholars in this Zoom room hail from the same hometown. Unless you happen to hail from Woodstock, Georgia, where Norm hails from, as you know if you've read this book, and where I also happen to hail from. Is that crazy? You probably don't realize how bizarre this is, because Woodstock, at least in the 1980s or 1990s, ain't exactly London or Dubai. You must understand that Woodstock, a town portrayed in Tom Wolfe's A Man in Full as being too poor, too rural, and too far away from Atlanta ever to be a successful suburb, was in fact, when Norm and I were growing up, really out in the sticks, as the kids say. But in 2025, I actually recently visited Woodstock. Mr. Wolfe's prophecy was wrong. It's actually extremely bougie and growing kind of crazily. But in the Woodstock of Norm's youth and in the Woodstock of my youth, xenophobia was more common than xenophonophilia in Woodstock. So I'd just like to point out that Norm and I are both from the same hometown. His Little League baseball coach, Joe Ragsdale, coached a brother of a friend of mine. It's peculiar that two guys on quite different paths wound up studying Xenophon and became devotees of his masterpiece, The Education of Cyrus. There must be something in the water in Cherokee County, Georgia. Let me also add that Norm and I are roughly the same age. So in addition to being both fans of Xenophon, we also happen to have the same warehouse of popular music from which to pull. I also happen to be a huge Paul Simon fan, and The Rhythm of the Saints is an album that I wore out listening to in 1990 or 91, a book that he mentions near the beginning and then repeatedly throughout the book. I mean, really, does anybody on this Zoom call know what Six Pack is besides Norm and I? I have to say no is the answer to that, yes? Okay, good. It's a wonderful movie starring Kenny Rogers and some brats, and he teaches them how to do NASCAR. We're the only two. So Norm and I must be some kind of bizarro versions of one another. One more brief aside, I'll just echo what was mentioned a moment ago. I rather enjoyed your discussion of your father. He seems like many men that I've known. It's kind of buried in the book. Perhaps you should consider making this some kind of a standalone eulogy for your father. I hope that your family members come across it. Okay, but on to my comments. Keeping with the theme of what Norm and I have in common, let me begin my substantive remarks with a statement of homo frosune, to coin a word that he uses, yes? I agree with Professor Sandridge that the classics, not classics, lest I summon Norm's rebuke, that is to say the humanities, the liberal arts, the great books, are the best books available on what we might call leadership. As you put it on page 229, you learn the foundations of leadership through the study of the humanities. I think there's no better source. To modify a similar quote for my purposes, 100 pages, 10 pages of Xenophon introduces us immeasurably better into how to lead human beings than the volumes written in that spirit predominant in our age. I challenge you to find a leadership book that's half as good. Now, this is true, I believe, but you note on page 224 that fewer and fewer humanities courses are being taught. Is this a failure on the part of leadership of folks like you and me? We're unable to persuade people of the value, the usefulness, specifically in leadership of the humanities. Should that be a part of our goal? To whom should we speak as we try to defend the humanities when it comes to leadership? Which leads to my first question. So I just have a number of questions for Norm and then a few more comments. Who is this book for? Who do you hope reads it? What do you want them to take away? What in your wildest dreams, Norm? This was a pretty wild dream I read, but another wild dream, what would be the most successful reception of this book that you could imagine? I enjoyed it, but its manner of proceeding is, shall we say, unconventional. I was reminded, of course, of Xenophon's dream in the Anabasis, or maybe Cyrus's dream at the end of the Cyropaedia. I also happen to have recently read On Prophecy and Dreams. So I was wondering if you had any of this in mind. Is your book in any way a commentary on the role of dreams in Xenophon or any other Greek thinker? Is there a hint of the divine or the demonic in what you're presenting here? I'll just point out that the book raises this question of audience on page 145 in a series of rhetorical questions. Is it a leadership book, self-help book? Is it an ode to the classics or a Platonic dialogue or the memoir of a, quote, nobody? That's your words, not mine, Norm. I wouldn't say that. Are you speaking to students? Is this to students about how to become leaders, or is it to your fellow humanities professors about how to lead students? Or who are we leading? Howard students are surely different than the students I have here at Ashland University. But I wonder if some of the virtues that you single out still speak to their hearts, or if there are new ones. In other words, the virtues you mentioned a few times strike me as sort of progressive virtues that men of our age who are progressive probably sort of hold dear to hearts. It's not clear to me that 18 to 22-year-olds still do. Maybe they do, I don't know. Second question is about order or structure. The book gives the impression of lacking a structure, but there are parts, as you sort of wonderfully summarized. And I'll point out that it seems there are at least two major parts that seem to be mirror images of one another. So on the one hand, as you've already mentioned, Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Elon. But then on the other hand, three sort of fictional characters, Simone, Paddington, and Rockefeller. So it seems to be a sort of mirror there. Maybe you want to stick to the absurdist character of the presentation, but I was wondering if there wasn't sort of mother thought behind these choices and having parallels. My third question is about books. Three books came up again and again in your book, two with great intentionality, and one that recurred, at least in my view, without the same intentionality. The first is, of course, The Education of Cyrus, then Ayn Rand. Here, by the way, is another shared experience between Norm and I. Some adult gave us Ayn Rand when we were teenagers. I confess that it's one of a handful of books that I put down halfway through and have never returned to. I found it insufferable. So there's a difference between Norm and I. He found Ayn, at least in his youth, he liked Ayn Rand, and I did not. The third book is the Bible. You make occasional references throughout the book to the Bible. I was just wondering if you could say more here. You stress how the humanities could help us. Is the Bible one such book that can help us understand leadership? Can you provide a list of books and link them to leadership lessons? Do the books agree? Does the Bible agree with Xenophon? Does Ayn Rand? No, obviously not agree with Xenophon. Fourth question, or fourth comment, I suppose, is about your definition of leadership, which is on page 95, 97, and then 131 and following. Leadership is the art of addressing humanity's needs and activating humanity's potential. You expand this to everyone, humanity, comprehensively, everything. It's imperial. But then you scale it back after an empire. You should rule your own empire, not tend to our own gardens, but rule our own empire. Very good. It seems to me that Cyrus takes this definition from his father and runs with it. His father says, just give them the necessary things, and then that's enough. But Cyrus takes it upon himself to provide everyone with everything. He tries to become the dispenser of all things that are good, which would mean, in addition, that he robs others of the opportunity to do the providing or to be virtuous. Cambyses just says provisions, the things that are necessary. You don't really need to take overruling from them. So I'll point out a couple of things. Dad's advice is much more limited than what Cyrus actually goes on to do. Dad's advice, and here I'm quoting the Loeb, he says, and while this was a great task, still to understand how to govern other people or human beings so that they might have all of the necessary things of life in abundance and might all become what they ought to be, this seemed to us worthy of all wonder or admiration. I will note that you softened what Cambyses says to Cyrus. You changed govern to care for. Note also that Cyrus changes what Cambyses says, but unlike Norm, he hardens it. He doesn't soften it. Cyrus changes it from govern to rule, arcane. And so I wonder if there isn't a crack of disagreement between Norm and Cyrus. That's the only real textual analysis of this Education of Cyrus that I'd be happy to explore as we discuss. My final question, rules of thumb. I find your book very interesting. I enjoyed it. It was nostalgic in a way for me. It was like we were old friends. But I was wondering if you had a list of practical prescriptions that you've drawn from Xenophon's Cyrus. Maybe this is too much to ask in a book of this sort, because it presents itself as a stream of unconscious thought. But here I'll just kind of segue into my own remarks. So here are just a few things. I've been in the provost position now for 6 months. And people are, I try not to flatter myself. I think I'm doing an okay job, and people express great surprise at how well I'm doing, because I have no experience in administration. And I've read no leadership books. They're astonished that I've not done this. And so they ask me, how are you so good? And I don't usually answer because the answer is Xenophon. The answer is I've read Xenophon and Plato and Shakespeare and the Bible. And so here are just a few rules of thumb as I sort of work through these texts and thought of myself. Number one, I mean, these are all very, very small. Learn names. Like, it seems to be important to people that you know who they are. And Xenophon, they discussed this about, Xenophon wants to know the name of all of his soldiers, just like a mechanic should know tools, or a doctor should know his tools as well. So that's a small point. Second one, and I think this has been much more helpful for me, is it's the humanities has helped me to understand human types and their longings. So I'll say this as an exaggeration. I think if one has read all of Plato or all of Shakespeare, one will never encounter another new human being, for what it's worth. Third, put others in a place to display their virtue. And here, maybe this is the second part, Norm, of your leadership idea. So I'm not actually trying to do the virtuous thing for them. I'm trying to put people in a position to do virtuous things themselves. Fourth, be quick to forgive and slow to blame. I'm thinking here of the advice that the sophist teacher gives to Tigranes in book 3 of the Education of Cyrus. Fifth, rhetoric. When I was a young man, I thought that people who were good at speaking were sort of empty blowhards, but I'm now realizing that actually speaking well is an essential part of effective leadership. And I think that this is one reason that Xenophon is quite successful in leadership as well. I'm thinking, of course, of Lincoln, who criticizes Henry Clay for not paying sufficient attention to the role, especially in a republic, for the power of words. Sixth is indecision. I've noticed that a lot of my peers seem to be marked by indecision. Here I have a quote from Cicero, but I think it applies also to Xenophon. You just have to make decisions. And I think that oftentimes people get paralyzed because they think there's no right or perfect answer. There is no perfect answer. So just make a decision and do the best you can. 7, be ready to step aside. Churchill was unceremoniously defenestrated after World War II. And at least a couple of times in the Anabasis, as Ellen kind of alluded to, Xenophon himself is willing to step aside. 8th, I would just point out that I think the psychology of gratitude has helped me to be a better ruler. Here I'm thinking especially of the discussion about gratitude between Tigranes, again, and Cyrus in book 3. And then the last one, I just have B+. I actually have this on a sticky note on my desk, which just means be nice. You're thinking this is not very Xenophontic, but here it is. My last bit of advice that I learned from my mom when I was a child, but then Xenophon drove home and it sounded more philosophical. So if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. As Xenophon says in the Anabasis, surely it is more noble and more just and more pious and more sweet to remember the good things than the bad. We should always strive to emphasize and remember the good in people. So with that, I close. Thank you very much.
This is wonderful. Thank you. Very thought-provoking. Great questions. So yeah, thank you so much to all three of you. Now, how about we hand back to our our main author, Norman, to respond to some of those questions from our two respondents, and then just for a couple of minutes maybe, and then we open the floor to everyone.
Yeah, I was going to say, how much time do we have? Like, each one of these questions is like a hour-long or more answer. They're so good. I'll be very brief.
Yeah, I'd suggest brevity, and then we open it up and see.
2 Norman minutes here. First off, thanks so much to Ellen and Greg. It's really, you got it. Like, who's my audience? You guys. Like, I am really grateful for the level of engagement and careful reading that you have shown. Let me, Greg, you asked a million questions. I'm going to try, and the great ones. Let me answer one of Ellen's and one of Greg's, and then maybe others who have read the work, they want to think, they can opine about what they think it means to answer your questions or pose additional ones. Ellen, just briefly on the topic of self-full leadership, I want to say that, first off, one of my core issues in leadership always is, why does anyone do it? There are a million bad reasons, or let's say the question, to what extent does one's motivation for leadership ever get in the way of addressing their needs and activating their potential? A straightforward example would be the CEO who wants $1 trillion as part of their package. for running a company. And, all, if the motive is there is wealth or prestige or more power, like that can get in the way of all of that. And then also is the question of like, okay, we all need motivation to lead. Like, what does that motivation need to be? So if you read the leadership discourse these days, you often get two options. One is we don't want selfish leaders, right? We don't want someone who is only doing it for the money or is doing it in a very contractual way. Like, you pay me enough, I'll do the job. You give me enough perks, like, that can go badly. So that kind of selfish leadership, I don't think we want. Similarly, you hear a lot of praise for what is sometimes called servant leadership or selfless leadership, where the person really does just kind of show up and whatever is needed, they will adapt to those. They will become that kind of leader. I mean, I bet, Greg, to some extent, has or will face pressures like that as a provost. Like, here's the stuff you like doing, but the list of things that need to be done is much, much longer. So you have to decide, like, okay, how much of myself am I going to give up in this role? So my point about self-full leadership is just that your leadership, in an ideal world, your leadership would be aligned with the things that you're passionate about, the things that you take pride in, the things that you really want to do, and that we shouldn't, hopefully we're not being asked to just indiscriminately adapt ourselves to whatever needs and potential need to be addressed at the given moment. And I'll give you my, the locus classicus for self-full leadership is Moana for me. Because if you've ever seen the Disney movie Moana, she is, cast in this role of, you're going to be a chief like everybody else. You're going to stay on the island and so forth. But of course, she hears the call of the ocean. She has a, thirst for adventure. And in the end, she finds a way to merge that, passion for voyaging and exploration with actually addressing the needs and potential of her own people. So I'm thinking of that as my example. To Greg, a million questions. The audience question is a great one, and I'll go back to what I said in my opening remarks. I wanted to speak to everyone. That's a grandiose claim, probably narcissistic. I wanted something that would speak to everyone. And that's part of the challenge in writing a book like this. If you've ever tried that, and that's largely the reason the book is self-published, because I pitched it to a number of different agents, and the feedback I got was like, you need a much more narrow audience. I mean, even if you say, I'm going to write a leadership book, it's like, okay, is it a business leadership book? Okay, which business? Is it about organizational management? Is it about character? Like, in every publication genre these days, they want something very, very narrow. And I wanted a hub, if you will. I wanted a place that lots of people with different backgrounds could come together. And to turn it back to us as Xenophon scholars, like, we know all of these wonderful things about Xenophon, but we have a huge messaging problem, right? People don't just want to pick up Xenophon in mass and start reading him and exploring all the questions that we think are so great because he's an ancient author, like, all the barriers psychologically that people will face. And I'll reference, Emily wanted me to say a little bit more about this. The work that I do in Callion is a lot of kind of missionary work or evangelical work to get people, ultimately to read Xenophon and, some of the other works that we love. And the construction company in San Antonio, Texas, very, very amazing, enlightened company that we've been working with. I didn't just show up at their door and say, hey, you know what? Xenophon has lots of great ideas about leadership. Could you give me a 5-minute elevator pitch to tell you why Xenophon is so great? No, I started by doing a program with them on the television show Ted Lasso. And they liked it so much that I was like, you know what? Like, you guys can read, like, people that work in construction companies can read, Xenophon, wrote this book for a general audience, give it a try. And, it was by this gradual, dialogue, building trust, that they came to say, oh yeah, the CEO of the company, the president of the company read The Education of Cyrus. He loved it. It resonated with so much of his own leadership. And that was the inroad. But as I say, we have a huge rhetorical hurdle, obviously. And as I said, by writing this book in my own small way, I hoped I was bringing together, there's something for everyone. To quote, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Like, everybody who's read this work has found a different thing, whether it's six pack or whatever. They found a different thing to connect with. And I'll say, with my students, a dozen or more of my students have already read it. I've given them free copies to read. They'll read it in 2 weeks, and they come back and they're like very grateful for the opportunity to think about these questions, but also to feel like they know me. So, so far so good in terms of doing that. We'll see how it goes, but I'll stop there because I don't want to take up any more time. But thank you both again so much.
Thank you very much, Norman. And I should say, as someone who just a few months ago stepped up into the chairship at UNC in the classics department, both the session and your book have been quite helpful. I think the idea of self-full leadership, somehow, becoming a leader but not completely abandoning everything, that really interests you and that you're passionate about. I think that's a really important concept. But yeah, let me just open up the floor for anyone who would like to comment or respond to anything, either from today or from the book. William.
Yeah, I got a question for you, Greg. When you said that the Cyropedia was Xenophon's masterpiece, I mean, that could be taken in a couple of ways. I mean, it's a masterpiece by Xenophon, but there's also a superlative element in what you said. And as a pretty firm believer that the Oikonomicus is Xenophon's masterpiece, I wanted to ask you, since I haven't read Norm's book, I want to ask you who have read the book, is that what I've missed in this discussion so far is what I principally love in the Oikonomicus, which of course is A, Socrates, but B, what emerges in the last chapter of what I might call the democratization of leadership. In other words, in the face of young Critobulus, who dreams of becoming Cyrus the Great, and I take it when we take Xenophon's ideal of leadership as either a Agesilaus or one of the Cyruses, that we miss an important point that, first of all, Socrates is the primary leader, and it seems to me that Xenophon is most interested in, was his leader, and he modeled his leadership on his. But that last chapter of the Oikonomicus, where you're persuading the young kid that although you're dreaming of these, kingly leadership roles, that if you could go out to the field that your father has entrusted to you and get the servants out there to work in a competitive and eager way, you would have every virtue that any king could. In other words, do you? I'm with you on Ayn Rand. So Ayn Rand equals sufferable, not for me. So it strikes me that if you really are sympathetic to Rand in a way that I'm not and that you said you're not, that you might be resistant to what was called the democratization of virtue, or rather the democratization of leadership, which seems to me an essential theme in Xenophon, to archikon, whether of a cavalry commander or of an epitropos in a field, that the basic virtue is completely democratized in Xenophon. So I'm wondering, do you see any of that in Norm's book? Because I'll read it if you do.
Sure. First thing I'll say is Norm should jump in, but Norm also abandons Ayn Rand. Like, this was a youthful indiscretion on his part. It's a dalliance. It's an intellectual. It's a bad idea. He's atoned for his sins, as far as I can tell, on Ayn Rand. So your two parts of your question. One is obviously I agree that Socrates is the main figure for Xenophon, although I do think Cyrus is the main alternative to Socrates. But Norm, his definition of leadership absolutely comes from Cambyses, not Cyrus. And I would suggest that Cambyses is a kind of Socratic character in the education of Cyrus. And so there's a way, and there are others, by the way. I mentioned Tigranes, and then of course there's Tigranes' teacher. And so I think that Socrates slips in through Cambyses. And by the way, and it's very Socratic. It's a kind of Socratic dialogue between father and son, where he's trying to, Cyrus is this hotshot kid who thinks he knows it all. And his dad's like, don't you remember how I taught you this? And here's a new lesson. And remember how we said we thought this was going to be hard? And so I was like, yeah, I used to think it was hard until I saw my uncle do it, and he's an nincompoop. And so I think his father is trying to give him some sort of Socratic slowing down. So I do think that that's there. I'll just, to echo what you said, I think that I would also point to Xenophon himself as a successful ruler, or leader, as Norman does. And my reading of the Anabasis is that Socrates is who taught Xenophon how to lead. And it's contrasted with the education of the sophists, for example, Gorgias in particular. Regarding the democratization, I think I'll let Norm speak for himself, but I will attribute to him, this does strike me as a very democratic presentation of Xenophon. He's benevolent for all mankind. It seems not, I mean, Norm should speak for himself, but it does strike me as his presentation is very democratic.
Yeah, William, I'll just say, very succinctly, like for me, one of the powerful features of the octopus as a metaphor for leadership is that it's open to all of us. And I say this probably within the second or third page of the book, that it's a democratic form of leadership that I have in mind, that unlike other metaphors for leadership that almost come with a built-in hierarchy, whether you're calling the leader a lion or a shepherd or an architect or something like that, they almost have a baked-in asymmetrical power relationship and a hierarchy. And to me, that's one of the liberating things about an octopus as a metaphor, is that we can all embody it, and that we all. But I do use the language of empire there, because I want to highlight the idea that all of us have, Ellen alluded to this a little bit, all of us have different provinces in our lives, if you will, whether it's professional life, social life, friendship, parenting, civic life. We all have different provinces. And I think one of the challenges is to try to coalesce those in a way that we're leading and we're always hopefully doing well in all of those areas. But yes, I do see it as very democratic, and I am pushing back against any kind of authoritarian or hierarchical leadership.
I guess I meant, maybe the word democratic was wrong. I meant almost the word plebeianization of leadership. In other words, the not so much that the leader is benevolent towards the led, but that that leadership can be exercised on a much smaller scale and yet have all of the greatest characteristics of the greatest kings. That, it seems to me, is a core element in Xenophon, a determination to show that the archicon can be plebeianized. It can be, it could almost exist in a slave. It's a by example kind of approach. Anyway.
I just wanted to make a point that of Greg's very helpful list, putting others in a place to display their virtue. That seems to me less true of Cyrus, but very true of the vision of the ruler that Simonides suggests a hero. You don't want to be the one winning all those chariot races. You want to be the one who enables your citizens to be winning those chariot races. But in Cyrus's case, I mean, I may well be overlooking some things, but I don't see him as a leader so much putting others on display. I mean, he's on display, or am I forgetting something there, Norman?
A short answer to that, I think one of the things Cyrus does in terms of his matchmaking, I'm thinking of Tigranes in particular, that when Tigranes is asked by his wife after their dinner party with Cyrus, like, what did you think of Cyrus? And she was like, I wasn't thinking of Cyrus. Like, I was looking toward you. Like, I think Cyrus does lead in a way, or Panthea and Abradatus, like, he does give people these opportunities to show off, or Pharaolis, the Persian commoner, who like works his way all the way up the ranks. Of course, none of them ultimately for the reader, shine as much. But I think in the world of Cyrus, people are given that opportunity to distinguish themselves and to be loved for it and admired for it.
I suppose Caxares might be the counterexample. He says, you've just made yourself, you seem
Yeah,
more impressive. My men now admire you rather than me.
yeah. He's a loser though, so he doesn't deserve that.
Okay. So any more comments? We've got a couple of minutes left. Yes, Christopher.
Okay, there we are. Yes, I mean, first of all, can I just say I absolutely loved reading this book just as a literary artifact. Tremendously entertaining, engaging, and compelling, which is not a thing I thought I'd ever say about a book about leadership that wasn't absolutely constructed merely as analysis and commentary on an ancient text about leadership. This is a book about leadership, and I loved it. And there are an awful lot of books about leadership, as it were, in vacuo, or certainly not simply in a classics environment, which are anything but compelling and are certainly nothing like as much fun or more like, anything like as likely to make you actually laugh out loud quite frequently. Just going back to a bit of discussion that was just going on, the enabling thing. Yes, it's certainly true. There are some individuals in the Cyropeda who are undoubtedly enabled to show their potential. I come back, but it's kind of more complicated, isn't it? I mean, that bit in book 8, which basically says Cyrus, sussed out that actually making his courtiers fall into conflict with one another was actually quite a good way of controlling the situation, shall we say. I don't know. I mean, that's a different sort of discourse from a discourse about enabling the individual potential of any one of them, but it is part of the general picture. And I suppose my bigger point, as some people know, I spend a lot of my life trying to make Xenophon, as it were, difficult in the sense of being not actually straightforward. And I mean, it's absolutely true. Xenophon's texts are riddled through with leadership as an issue all the time. You're being called upon actually precisely to meditate upon it. And in a way, I mean, one of the things about Norman's book that seems to me to make it extremely Xenophontic is that it's a set of meditations, generically diverse and weird and wonderful in some ways, which make you think, but don't necessarily compel you to think in any particular way or to pick up something Greg said, to make decisions. I mean, I am dispositionally the world's worst person at making decisions. I just love people who can't make decisions. And in a way, my desire to read Xenophon as an author who is always slightly trying to undercut what we thought we just understood from something we read by saying, oh, but there's another angle on this. It's really quite tricky. Leadership ain't straightforward, nor is anything else. And you look from a different perspective. Well, and I mean, this produces a sort of indecision, which is fine if of course, if you're reading a text and trying to figure out what it's saying to you and how it may enrich your intellect, but isn't so much good if you actually want to be told how to manage particular situations involving human beings and produce outcomes that don't lead immediately to bloodshed and violent discord, but actually drive towards some sort of outcome. I have no doubt that reading Xenophon, as indeed reading quite a lot of other things, the Bible too, maybe Thucydides even, if we dare mention him, reading these texts kind of thoughtfully and meditatively enriches one's sense of to anthropinon, Thucydidean, and to that extent feeds your capacity for perhaps any sorts of interaction with other people of whatever sort. whether ones in which you might be actually kind of wanting to direct things in a particular way, but maybe not necessarily that sort either. I mean, there's a kind of way in which Norman's meditations are almost too Catholic, if you like. I mean, they drive more to some propositions about, well, if you like, about being a good person, not just being a good leader. And the two aren't necessarily the same, though obviously one hopes that people who are going to be leaders are good persons. But not all good persons may want to be leaders because, like me, they may be far too indecisive and uncertain exactly about how turning a view about how things should be into a series of stratagems to make them that way. Reading Humanities, I'm sure, is good for your morally informed understanding of fellow human beings, but even reading Xenophon may leave you in the end at a bit of a loss about what is the best way to exercise leadership that really does actually address the needs of the led and enhance their potential without anything else getting in the way. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think it's a very Xenophontic book from my angle because it offers you a lot of stuff to think with, above all. And some of the stuff is really great, and the variety of it in terms of if you like literary genre, in terms of the actual type of discourse, in terms of where the narrator stands. The Norman, the ego Norman, the Norman, the narrator, the Xenophon, the narrator, if you like. The variety of that comes across is absolutely wonderful. I'll shut up now.
Wow, well, that was absolutely a wonderful comment. Thank you, Christopher. And just in case any of you don't recognize Christopher, this is Christopher Tuplin, author of much wonderful work on
Hiding behind my initials. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I think since the one, well, here in Chapel Hill, the 1:30 mark has passed, we might wrap it up there. But how wonderful to come back with this beautiful reflection there um, on the idea at the end of the kind of Xenophontic character of Norman's book. We started with Ellen making some comments along similar lines, and I think this has been a very enlightening and productive session. And I'm glad that we came at the end to the idea of Xenophon, perhaps the less decisive Xenophon, inviting us to reflect on all these different leadership styles, but also simply ways of relating to other human beings of all stripes. Yeah, wonderful stuff. So thank you very much, everyone. Our next International Xenophon Society events will be in the spring. We've got some talks coming up with junior scholars paired with more senior scholars, but no one was willing to speak in the fall. They all wanted to wait for the next calendar year. So I think we probably won't have anything on the program until early in 2026. But I thank you very much again to our three speakers, and see you all soon, I hope.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Happy
everybody.
holidays. Be safe.
Cheers.